After my sister-in-law's sudden death, her husband moved in with his twins. My husband demanded I quit my job to care for them. When I refused and suggested hiring a maid, he snapped, hitting me on the head with a rolling pin. Bleeding and in pain, I called 911. As I lay in the hospital bed, I made a decision that put him behind bars in just 2 hours. My name is Sandra Carter, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down. I was 30 years old, a financial analyst living in Austin, Texas, and I had a life I thought was perfect until it wasn't. I was married to David Carter, a 35-year-old mechanic. He was hardworking, quiet most of the time, and dependable. At least that's how I used to see him. We had a simple but comfortable life in a modest 3-bedroom house on a quiet street. I worked hard at my job and brought in a stable income. David ran a small auto repair shop on the other side of town. We were a team, or so I believed. Things started changing when David's older brother, Ethan Carter, moved in with us. Ethan was 38, a widower who had just lost his wife, Rachel, to a sudden heart attack. The tragedy hit him hard, and understandably so. He was left with their 4-year-old twins, Liam and Ava, 2 innocent little kids who had no idea what life had just taken from them. David broke the news to me one evening while we were having dinner. "Sandra," he said in a voice that told me something serious was coming, "Ethan needs our help. Rachel's gone, and he doesn't know what to do with the kids." I told him he could come stay with us for a while. I paused, my fork hovering midair. "For a while?" I asked cautiously. "Yes, just until he gets back on his feet," David replied, almost too quickly. "He's going through a tough time, and it's the right thing to do. They don't have anywhere else to go." I won't lie, I was hesitant. I felt sorry for Ethan and the twins, but I also knew what it would mean for us. We weren't exactly living in a mansion, and my life was already busy enough balancing work and managing the house. But I couldn't say no. I told myself it was temporary, and helping family was the right thing to do. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at our doorstep with 2 small suitcases and 2 sleepy kids clutching his hands. I remember the moment vividly. David hugged Ethan tightly, carrying their bags inside, while I crouched down to greet the twins. "Hi, Liam." "Hi, Ava," I said softly, offering a smile. Liam shyly hid behind Ethan, while Ava gave me a half-smile that broke my heart. "It's so good of you to take us in, Sandra," Ethan said, his voice heavy with grief. "It's no problem," I replied warmly, though part of me wondered how long we could manage. At first, I did my best to make them comfortable. I cooked meals for everyone, cleaned up after the kids, and helped Ethan as much as I could. I even rearranged our guest room to give Ethan and the twins some space. But within the first week, it was clear how difficult things were going to be. The twins were too young to understand their mother was gone, and they acted out constantly. Liam cried at night, screaming for Rachel, while Ava threw tantrums over the smallest things. The house was filled with noise, and I barely had a moment to think. David, on the other hand, seemed completely unaffected. In fact, he was happier. He spent all his time with Ethan and the kids, laughing and playing as if we were one big, happy family. But I wasn't happy. I was exhausted. As weeks turned into months, I realized Ethan wasn't making any effort to get back on his feet. He didn't look for a job, and he spent most of his days lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone or watching TV. The twins ran wild in our home, leaving crayon marks on the walls, spilling drinks on the carpet, and breaking things without a care. I tried to talk to David about it. "David, this isn't working," I said one night as we lay in bed. "Ethan needs to start looking for a job. And the kids, the house is a mess. I can't keep up with all of this while working full-time." David frowned, turning toward me. "Sandra, they've been through so much. Ethan lost his wife. He needs time to heal. Why can't you be more understanding?" "I am being understanding," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "But this isn't sustainable. I can't do everything. I think we need to hire someone, a housemaid, maybe to help with the kids." David sat up, his expression darkening. "We're not hiring a maid. That's a waste of money. You're capable of handling it, Sandra. You're just being selfish." I stared at him, shocked. "Selfish?" David, I'm working all day and cleaning up after 5 people when I get home. How is that selfish? You're making a big deal out of nothing, he snapped, turning his back to me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tears stinging my eyes. I felt trapped in my own home. I had always believed David was on my side, but now, it was as if he had turned against me. The tension only grew worse from there. Every time I brought up Ethan's lack of effort or suggested ways to manage the chaos, David dismissed me. And then, the day came when David's demands went too far. One evening, as I served dinner, he said the words that changed everything. Sandra, you need to quit your job. I froze, the plate of food still in my hand. What? You need to quit your job, David repeated. Ethan can't handle the kids on his own, and we can't afford a maid. It's only fair that you stay home and take care of them. I put the plate down, my hands trembling. Are you out of your mind, David? I'm not quitting my job to babysit Ethan's kids. I've worked too hard for my career. David slammed his fork down on the table, his face red with anger. Ethan needs help. They're family, Sandra. You're supposed to support us, not fight against us. I have supported you, I shot back. But I'm not giving up my life for this. It's not fair to me. David glared at me, his jaw tight. You're being selfish. If you loved me, you'd do this for us. That was the moment I realized David no longer saw me as his partner. He saw me as someone to control. And what happened next would change everything. I wish I could say things got better after that argument, but they didn't. Instead, everything spiraled even further out of control. David refused to let the subject go, bringing it up at every opportunity. Sandra, you're not being fair to Ethan. You don't understand what he's going through, he would say, as though I was some cold, unfeeling person. It wasn't true. I felt terrible for Ethan, and I cared about the twins, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice my entire life. I had worked hard to become a financial analyst, building a career that gave me independence and pride. Now David wanted me to throw it all away, as if my life didn't matter. One evening, after yet another exhausting day at work, I came home to chaos. The living room looked like a tornado had passed through. Toys were scattered everywhere, juice was spilled across the coffee table, and Liam was jumping on the couch while Ava scribbled with crayons on the wall. Ethan was sitting on the recliner, glued to his phone. Ethan, I said, trying to stay calm, can you please help me with the kids? I've been working all day, and I just need a little break. He barely glanced up. They're fine, Sandra. They're just kids. Relax. Relax? How could I relax when my house was falling apart? I turned to David, who had just walked in, and I couldn't hold back anymore. David, this has to stop, I said, my voice shaking. The house is a disaster. Ethan isn't even trying to look for work, and the kids. Stop it, Sandra. David snapped, cutting me off. You're always complaining. Can't you see we're doing the best we can? The best you can? I shot back, feeling my anger bubble over. I'm the one who's working full-time and cleaning up after everyone. I'm exhausted, David. I can't keep living like this. David's face darkened, and he stepped toward me, his voice low and threatening. I told you what you need to do, Sandra. Quit your job and take care of things here. This is your responsibility. I stood my ground, refusing to back down. No, David. I won't quit my job. If you want help, hire a maid. That's the only solution. The moment I said it, I knew it would set him off. David's expression twisted in anger, his fists clenching at his sides. The room fell silent except for the sound of the twins playing in the background. David stormed into the kitchen, muttering under his breath. I followed him, ready to argue my point further, but before I could say anything, it happened. He grabbed the rolling pin from the counter, turning toward me with rage in his eyes. David, what are you doing? I whispered, fear gripping me as I took a step back. You just don't get it, Sandra, he shouted, and before I could move, he swung the rolling pin with brutal force. The pain exploded through my head like a bomb. I felt the world spin as I stumbled backward, crashing to the floor. My vision blurred, and I could hear the distant sound of Ava giggling from the other room, completely unaware of what had just happened. I lay there for a moment, unable to move, my head throbbing as warm blood trickled down the side of my face. I could barely make out David standing over me, frozen in shock, his face pale. I didn't mean, he stammered, but his voice sounded far away. Somehow, I managed to summon the strength to move. My hand fumbled in my pocket for my phone. Everything hurt, my head, my body, my heart, but I knew I had to call for help. 911, I whispered into the phone, my voice weak. Please help me. I don't remember much after that. I vaguely recall the paramedics arriving, their faces blurry as they leaned over me, asking me questions I couldn't answer. The last thing I saw before slipping into unconsciousness was David standing in the corner, his hands still trembling. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Bright lights glared down at me, and the sound of beeping machines echoed in the quiet room. My head was bandaged, and the pain was still there, though dulled by the medication they had given me. A nurse was standing beside me, her voice kind but professional. Sandra, you're in the hospital. You suffered a head injury, but you're going to be okay. I nodded weakly, tears stinging my eyes as the memories came flooding back. The argument. The rolling pin. David's face as he realized what he'd done. The nurse must have seen the look on my face, because she gently placed a hand on my shoulder. The police are here, Sandra. They need to talk to you. The police? My heart pounded. I hadn't even thought about what would happen next. I didn't want to think about David, about what he had done to me, but deep down, I knew I couldn't let this go. When the officer walked into my room, his face serious and concerned, I took a deep breath. It was time to tell the truth. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, can you tell me what happened? I nodded, my voice trembling as I began to speak. I told him everything about the arguments, the stress, the rolling pin. I didn't leave anything out. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. The officer wrote everything down, his expression grave. We'll take care of this, Sandra. Don't worry. You did the right thing. As he left the room, I lay back on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I realized that David had crossed a line I could never forgive. He had betrayed me, not just as a husband, but as a human being. That night, as I lay alone in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, my pain began to turn into something else, determination. David thought he could hurt me and get away with it. But he was wrong. I was going to make sure he paid for what he did. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I would not let David get away with what he did to me. I had spent years supporting him, loving him, believing we were a team. And what did I get in return? A brutal betrayal. A rolling pin to the head. That night, something inside me hardened. I would take my life back, and David would pay for every ounce of pain he caused me. The next morning, I woke up determined. My head still throbbed, and the bruises on my face were visible in the small mirror on the hospital wall. I looked at myself, pale, broken, but alive. And that was enough. I wasn't just a victim. I was stronger than this. The doctors ran more tests and confirmed I had a severe concussion, but I would recover with rest. My sister, Megan, came to visit me that afternoon. She had flown in from San Antonio the moment she heard what had happened. Seeing her face made me burst into tears. I hadn't let myself cry until then. Oh, Sandra, Megan said, sitting beside me and holding my hand. What did he do to you? I told her everything. Every argument, every demand David had made, and how it all ended with him losing control. Megan listened, anger flashing in her eyes. He's not going to get away with this, she said firmly. I know, I whispered. I'm going to make sure of that. After a few days, I was discharged from the hospital. I still felt weak, but the fire inside me burned brighter than ever. I had a plan and I was going to follow through. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence. I requested a copy of my medical report. It detailed my head injury, the bruising, and how I ended up in the hospital. I asked Megan to take photos of my bruises while they were still fresh. Every mark on my body was proof of David's violence. I wasn't going to let him hide what he had done. Next, I contacted the hospital staff and asked for written statements. The doctors and nurses remembered me clearly, the bruising, the confusion, and how I whispered that I had been attacked by my husband. They didn't hesitate to put it in writing. Once I had everything I needed, I made the call to the police. "Hello, this is Sandra Carter," I said, my voice steady. "I want to file a complaint for physical assault and domestic violence." The officer I spoke to was professional and patient, walking me through the process. I handed over my medical records, the photos, and the witness statements. Every piece of evidence painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. The next day, 2 officers arrived at our house. David wasn't expecting it. I wasn't there to see it happen, but Megan told me how they knocked on the door and arrested him right in the living room. He had the nerve to call me from the police station later that evening. "Sandra, what the hell did you do?" he shouted. "You called the cops on me?" I held the phone tightly in my hand, my voice calm. "Yes, David. I did. You hit me. You tried to break me, but you failed. You're going to face the consequences for what you did." He started shouting again, but I hung up. That was the last time I heard his voice for a while. The legal process moved quickly. My evidence was strong, and I had the police and hospital records to back me up. David's lawyer tried to argue that it was a moment of rage and not intentional, but no one believed it. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, and certainly not me. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. I sat in the courtroom, surrounded by Megan and my closest friends. David sat across the room, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He didn't even look at me. The prosecutor laid out the facts clearly. Mr. Carter assaulted his wife, Mrs. Sandra Carter, causing severe head injuries. The evidence speaks for itself: medical reports, photographs, and witness statements. David's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, but it was no use. The judge's voice echoed through the room as he delivered the sentence. "David Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison for physical assault and domestic violence. Additionally, the court will seize control of your property and savings to ensure financial penalties for your actions." Hearing those words was like taking a breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, I felt free. David's face went pale. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if he couldn't believe this was happening. But it was too late for regret. As I walked out of that courtroom with Megan by my side, I knew one thing for certain. My revenge was complete. David had taken so much from me, but I had taken back my power. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone take it away again. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight I had been carrying, of fear, anger, and betrayal, had finally been lifted. David was going to prison for 3 years, and his property and finances were now under court control. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe, and most importantly, I felt free. The weeks that followed were about picking up the pieces of my life. Megan stayed with me for a while, helping me pack up my belongings from the house I had shared with David. Walking through that house was painful. Every room was filled with memories, both good and bad, but I knew I couldn't stay there. "Are you sure about moving out, Sandra?" Megan asked one day as we carried boxes to the car. "I'm sure," I replied firmly. "That house isn't home anymore. It's a reminder of everything I went through. I need a fresh start." I found a small, cozy apartment on the other side of Austin, not far from my office. It wasn't big, but it was perfect for me. For the first time, I was living in a space that was completely mine, free of chaos, free of tension, and free of David. The first few days alone were strange. I wasn't used to the quiet, but soon, I began to embrace it. I started filling my apartment with things that brought me joy: soft cushions, potted plants, warm lamps that gave the place a golden glow. I even picked up a new hobby: cooking. It felt good to create something for myself, something that wasn't for anyone else's approval. My job at the financial firm became a lifeline during this time. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and earning recognition from my boss. For years, I had put everyone else's needs ahead of my own, but now I was rediscovering who I was: a woman who was strong, capable, and independent. One day, I received a letter in the mail. It was the finalization of my divorce from David. Holding that paper in my hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was official. That chapter of my life was closed, and there was no going back. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened. For a while, I had been angry, not just at David, but at myself for letting things get so far. But over time, I realized something important. I wasn't weak for staying as long as I did. I was strong for leaving. I was strong for standing up for myself and seeking justice. David had underestimated me. He thought he could control me, silence me, and break me. But I proved him wrong. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I learned to find joy in the little things, like the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the peace of my apartment, and the satisfaction of knowing that I was finally living for myself. One evening, as I watered the plants on my balcony, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the city. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the warm air, and I smiled. David's betrayal and cruelty had nearly broken me, but I survived. I didn't just survive, I thrived. I reclaimed my strength, my dignity, and my future. This is my story. It's not just about betrayal or revenge. It's about rising up when life tries to knock you down. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free.